So I'm Daniel Garcia, and today we're going to be talking about designing habitats for soil life. Before we get started though, just give you a little bit of background info about who I am, where I come from. So I'm born and raised in Visalia, California. It's a small city next to Fresno in the Central Valley. I come from many generations of farm workers, and I didn't actually grow up around produce or growing food or soil. I grew up in a very Americanized lifestyle. My parents and my family, they of course worked heavily in the fields. They got not compensated well, and they got covered in toxicity. So it's not something they wanted for me, and so they pushed education, education, education. And I kind of, again, lived this American lifestyle, overindulged, as we were talking about a moment ago, and I had a lot of medical issues come up. And so I ended up not being able to pick up a spoon to my face and feed myself. I couldn't walk more than like a half a block without having to take a 45-minute break just to recoup just to get over the fact that I'm gonna have to go through more pain to make that next half block. And then, I was on 30 pills a day, had a bunch of surgeries, and the doctors were like, you may never walk again. Things are only gonna get worse. So I was like, you know what? The animals in nature seem to recover pretty quickly if a predator doesn't eat them in that process. But if given the chance, nature has the ability to recover. So I was really inspired by that. So I started studying, I became a master gardener, I took some permaculture courses, I took Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil food web course, and I met with growers from all over the world who were like experts in their fields. And so I kind of took all these tidbits, and I went home and I was like, I'm gonna grow my own food, but I can't do it myself because I can't pick up a spoon, so I couldn't pick up a shovel. So I paid someone. I paid someone to grow my food, and for 1 year, I pretty much grew majority of my own food, avoided the grocery store as much as possible, and at the end of that year, I was doing handstand push-ups. So that was pretty cool, and I'm standing and walking now, right? I'm doing cool stuff. Thank you. So I realized the power of what was kind of happening by essentially investing in my environment. And I realized I was like, oh, it's not just growing food, but like I was cleaning up my inputs. Whether it's air, water, I was filtering everything that I was inputting, and I was like, this is really interesting. And local growers, agriculture, all kinds of people got interested in what I was doing because they saw the results that I was getting, which were far beyond what they were getting locally. So everyone started coming to my backyard, and they started being like, hey, well, how do I do this on my farm? How do I do this in my garden? So that's when we started our business, Regenerative Living. And basically, that's now what I do is I design and construct urban food systems as well as agricultural systems. And we're very focused on soil ecology, the soil food web, and of course, designing habitat for them, because if we do not have the right habitat, we're just releasing them and then hoping for the best, which isn't really ideal. So let's get started. So why? So some of the benefits of designing for your habitat for your soil life, which is basically the same benefits of having your soil life, but of course by having the habitat, allowing for these organisms to really flourish, you're going to get more pronounced of an effect. So we can increase productivity, and it's all about community. And these are only a few of the benefits. Literally, there could be a whole list here. But increased productivity is something I saw locally. We were planting fruit trees, and these fruit trees were yielding 300 fruits in one season. And they were these little baby, like 3-foot trees, and then they were growing to 16 foot by the next year and producing massive amounts of produce. And so we again, trying to grow a majority of what I eat, seeing the productivity go up quickly and not waiting 3 to 5 years for that tree to produce and feed my family was really cool. Increased nutrient density. So instead of just the traditional feeding your NPK salts, right, and ignoring all the rest of the nutrients, by focusing on habitat, focusing on the biology, we then get to mine the soil particles or the bacteria and fungi, of course, and we start the nutrient cycling process. The nutrients ultimately make their way into your produce. You get more nutrient density. Reduced inputs. So one farm we were working with recently, we actually did some of the soil layering practices we're going to talk about here. And in 1 year, we reduced their fertilizer by 90% and their water use by 70%. And so just by really developing the ideal situations for the organisms to thrive, you can really greatly reduce your total inputs, cost, but also really, create a more sustainable system. Pests and disease. So really, pests and disease aren't necessarily bad. Something kind of Janelle was talking about. They got to be present in the system. They stimulate, a healthy, balanced system. But it's all about keeping them in the right ratios. And so by creating a habitat that supports the good guy organisms, then you then have the opportunity for them to outcompete a lot of these bad guy organisms, or again, bad guy organisms necessary, but it keeps them in a suppressed to a certain extent, so they don't just overcome our system. Remediating toxicity. So obviously biology, as again Janelle was talking about, we can remediate with the soil biology, but we need obviously the organisms to be at their peak potential to expedite the process. So by creating habitat for them again, allowing them to do their thing, we get this increased rate of reduction of toxicity. Soil structure, again, these are some more things that Janelle spoke on. Suppressing weeds. So not everyone knows this, but as you create a more balanced system, your fungi can actually keep your nitrogen in a form that suppresses weed growth. It really doesn't feed the weeds. Where if you have a high bacterial soil, which pretty much everyone has, and also everyone has weeds, that's creating a nitrogen that the weeds love. So by creating a community of organisms in your soil, you can suppress your weeds in a more balanced approach. And you kind of see that when you go into a forest too. If you ever go into a forest and try to see the weeds, even if you take the weed seeds and you spread them, they won't germinate because the soil conditions aren't right. Increase soil carbon sequestration. Again, Janelle covered that. And healthy microbiomes for people. This is something that I'm huge on because most of our soils are deficient in a balanced ecosystem. And so we get maybe some beneficial bacteria, maybe, keywords, because a lot of our ag is pretty sad. But you get a lot of these, you get a deficiency of diversity of organisms. And so we're always wondering, like, why are we so sick? Well, we don't have a community living on our skin. And we used to get that from nature, but it's hard to find nature nowadays because we spray almost everything with fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, this, that, and so we don't have balance. So my thing is like, not just creating habitat for the soil life, but then getting you out and touching the organisms, getting them growing on you, in you. And then I even encourage, if anyone's staying in the dorm with us, I installed a water filter so we can bathe in non-chlorinated water and protect our microbiome. Okay, so next. So preliminary testing. So before we get started building habitat, it's always nice to just get to some preliminary testing. You can do some soil food web testing. So again, Janelle was talking about, gives you your ratios, your fungal to bacterial ratios. Also gives you some numbers for your predators. And just really gives you a baseline. What are you starting with? Also, you can figure out like what crops am I trying to grow, and then we can kind of start dialing in, what direction you need to go to really support those plants. Of course, if you think you have some residual heavy metals, salts, pesticides, etc., which a lot of people have issues like this, it's nice to get a before picture. One property I was working on not too long ago, we developed a community garden, had a ridiculous amount of lead. They were parking old cars on it, and so there was a lot of stuff just leaching into the soil. And in 1 year, we were able to convert that soil into something that was edible for people. So really contaminated, but again, we were very focused on inputs, making sure that we were making the right habitat for the organisms. But so preliminary testing is nice because you know your baseline, and then should I be eating from this right now, or where do I need to go from there? Water testing, something I'm huge on. I don't do a lot of water testing for like residential, urban kind of stuff. I just always use a water filter, and it's mostly focused on chlorine, but still there's some other stuff in there that I'm trying to reduce. But with wells, I'm always pushing people, get your water tested. Now, it doesn't have to be every year, but every once in a great while, I like to start at least in the beginning, preliminary, 2 tests. So one early in the season when your water table's high, and that's because your water table, basically a mineral bowl, and so those minerals concentrate in the water as the water table goes down. So when your water table's high, they're more diluted, and so salts, metals, anything that might be in there is diluted, so it may not kill your soil biology, and your plants will definitely survive because it's irrigation quality. But once you get to later in the season where your neighbor or yourself is really pulling off that well, next thing you know, the water table starts concentrating all of those minerals, heavy metals, whatever salts are in that water table, and you may not kill your plants, so you may not see the exact, but your soil life is feeling it, and so monitoring your water, and then you can also do some microscope testing if possible to really see how your organisms are growing throughout the season. So quality water. These are just some of the filters I use in urban situations. I'm still figuring out how to filter water in agriculture. We're experimenting based on the materials that they have on hand and the equipment. So every site's a little different, but you guys aren't large scale like that, so I'm not expecting you guys to probably need something along those lines. But something simple like a garden hose filter to where you can actually do a small amount. Or something like this is more for like if you have larger scale, you have an irrigation system and you need pressure, especially if you have a lot of emitters, you need something with pressure. But something along the lines of something like this is what I use. Of course, you could do your own research, figure out what you want to use. So that's how we kind of do it. So mimicking nature though, again, just getting back to like nature doesn't apply chlorine and salted water and all. I mean, the rainwater before we contaminated the heck out of our environment was pretty clean. And so always, again, looking to nature for an example. If another option too that I actually did so these are the ones I used to use at my house, and then I grow majority of what I eat. So I have a pretty big amount of food to grow. So I ended up installing a whole house water filtration system, and I'm probably the first person to buy, specifically for my plants. And then I realized like, oh, this is good for me too. But I actually was the first person probably who purchased a whole house water filtration system specifically for my plants or my soil life, because I really cared about them.
Do you do any rain barrel collection, water collection?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm starting to do that. I use IBC totes, but food grade. So I just make sure that you're using a container that hasn't been contaminated, and also if you're going to be collecting from your roof or something, being sure to not use like I have the Spanish style tile roof, which is a lot cleaner than I'm forgetting what it's called right off the top of my head, but the asphalt, yeah, that stuff has a lot of contaminants that'll leach in. Either way. Yeah, so you got to be careful of what you're harvesting off of. Even though if I had like asphalt or something, I would still probably harvest off of it, but I wouldn't use it directly. I'd filter it, which we're going to teach you how to make biochar in a little bit, or a carbon, which you can use to help as a filtration media. And the only reason I would harvest it is because, otherwise that water's got to go down the drain, pollute someone else's environment. And my thing is, I'd rather capture everything coming into my environment, filter it, clean it, and just handle it on site. And so, again, we'll talk about making your own carbon materials, and even I like these filters specifically because you can take them apart and then you can make your own carbon for free from your yard waste or from your site waste, and then you can essentially just use these as housing, for forever. So you have like this forever life. Yeah.
Have you done a comparison of when you're watering compost using filtered versus non-filtered water, if it makes a difference?
I haven't personally done it, but I would say that it's very likely that you're going to see a difference because, if you're using chlorine and stuff like that, it's going to suppress. The microbes are pretty hardy, especially some of the bacteria. So you're still going to, a lot of people that are composting are using, they're using tap water and it has chlorine in it and it works. They get thermophilic, and if it wasn't getting hot, then biology is obviously there because it's getting hot. So, but to essentially limit my inputs of toxicity and to really make sure that my end, because otherwise some of that toxicity has got to bind to those humic acids and so it's taking up some space in that filtration qualities of the soil. or the composting qualities. And I prefer, again, to just not put in too many. I really try to remediate as much as possible and lessen my total inputs. But I would say that, yeah, it's probably being, I haven't done it. Maybe Janelle can speak to that. Have you ever tested with filtered water versus not filtered water with compost at all?
I notice a little bit of difference in maintaining temperature or getting up to temperature. So the site that I currently operate at, we have 2 water sources depending on what time of year. The property owner has some holding ponds that they collect water in, and so for half of the year in the summertime, we use that, and then when those are maxed out, then he switches over to city water. And it definitely knocks stuff down a little bit. It slows things down a little bit, definitely. We have, I think, just chlorine in our water there, but especially when it's cold and it doesn't volatilize out of the water. It takes the piles a lot longer to get hot. Yeah.
Sorry, so one follow-up question then. If you were to just take the water, let it sit, let the chlorine gas off, would that make a big enough difference to be worth the effort?
Chlorine evaporates. Chloramine does not evaporate.
Right.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you have.
Yeah, and one guy I was talking to recently, he was saying that his municipal water treatment plant switches it up. So at one period of the year, they actually use chlorine, and then they use chloramine another period. So for me, especially because that's just not enough water, because I need more water for my site, and that would be a lot of time to just move to gas off if it was just chlorine. If it's chloramine, obviously you can't gas it off. But I'm usually time deficient, so using an inexpensive water filter is something that I do. And then again, I'm always trying to teach people how to not need to buy things. So that's why we'll talk about making your own filtration media so that you can essentially save time in the future. And then also convert your waste into a black gold, which is pretty cool.
Yeah.
Just a little bit on that note, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on gray water systems and using that for.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of gray water systems. Obviously, you just got to make sure that when you're doing gray water that you're not using any contaminant type products. So do your research, make sure that everything is going to be, meets, there's certain products that follow those guidelines. If you want, you can follow up with me, and I have some friends and some website resources that I can hand you that have done a lot of research on gray water use, and they would be able to really direct you on what inputs work best for dishwashing, laundry, etc. But I'm a huge fan of gray water use, and I do a lot of infiltration swales too. And even if you don't water your plants, you can pour it into an infiltration swale and then get that water to go down and sideways, and then you plant some fruit trees or any of your trees nearby, and then all of a sudden magically you get trees growing with little to no water added. And I love to show people that in the Central Valley where everyone's dry and we're overwatering all the time, and I'm like, I don't love the fact that I have redwoods in my backyard, because obviously they're not meant for the Central Valley, but they're there and I didn't want to chop them down. Sorry, one second, sorry. But yeah, it's just basically, short story is that these trees were dying, and I set up these infiltration swales, and I couldn't figure out how to get these trees to come back. And then after I installed these infiltration swales, halfway through the rainy season, these trees came back magically, and they've now needed no water added for over 5 years, and they look like they're fully irrigated. So yeah, there's definitely reuse your water.
Is that partially because of the system you have installed, is helping the plants and trees absorb the water better? And do you have calcium, like hard water, where you live?
Our water isn't too hard. We definitely have calcium, but it's not excessive. I would definitely say it's definitely helping the plants, more so by helping the biology along again, because it helps the biology thrive, which then the biology can create the soil structure, so the air and water passageways, and then the roots can follow that. And so the roots can go deeper, they can essentially allow for more infiltration of that water. When the rain occurs, it's not just sitting on top of the soil. The biology is creating, we have a lot of clay, and the water usually wants to stand on top of the soil. We turn it all into sponge-like soils. So we basically support the biology I think of it as like nature's free labor, also slash super scientists. And they just go in, they restructure, they make everything, they fix the feng shui in the soil, and next thing you know, your plants are uptaking much more water. They don't need so much. So yes, it's not a direct, it's not the filtered water that is, but it's the filtered water supporting the life, supporting those super scientists that are then creating the structures and all the components that are necessary to allow your trees to need.
Because, yeah, in the desert, the problems we have is really hard water.
Yeah.
Very calcium, and I'm looking into other solutions. There's something called magnesium that uses physics to.
Yeah, is it like electromagnetics? Yeah, if you want to talk more about after this, because I'm limited on time, but I'd love to continue this conversation.
That can be a presentation for all of us.
Okay, so again, I was kind of talking about this a little bit, so clean inputs. So I know Janelle was talking about fertilizers earlier and how they have salts and how they're, you don't want to use a lot of them. So if you are going to use a fertilizer, which I generally do in the beginning to kind of stimulate my biology, but after a period of time, I pretty much get off of fertilizers. But I'm not using the salt-based chemical stuff. I'm literally using plant meals or just literally organic materials that are dried, ground, etc. And they're slow release. So they're not going to just be like syringe that you just inject into the system and bypasses the biology, and then the plant's like, oh, I don't need you, biology. I got this other system to feed me. No, we don't do that. We put down fertilizers because really, again, it's just organic matter that hasn't been composted. And by picking the certain plants that are known for high levels of nutrients, these are other options for fertilizers. So I try to avoid a lot of organic growers I work with that use gypsum or sulfur, and I always try to tell them like avoid it. Like whenever we do soil testing, when they're using these materials, we usually see the biology get knocked back. And so even though it's organic, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to actually promote a healthy soil or a healthy soil biome. And of course, just again, like Jeanette was on, no chemical fertilizers. There's no salt-based fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, all the other chemical stuff. We just want to really make sure that we're limiting our inputs and dialing it in, making sure that we're putting the right inputs for the right job. So, all right, I'm just going to leave it, even though it's got the little top thing. We can still see it. Okay, so when we're putting in inputs, so like for instance, there's some bacterial foods. So say if you had a high bacteria soil, you don't want to put in a bunch of molasses or simple sugars, anything in this bacterial foods kind of list, because you're going to continue to feed the bacteria. And if say you have a tree that needs a fungally dominated soil, because the way I think of it is like a forest grows on a fallen forest. So the tree is dropping down leaves and high carbon rich woody material on the ground. It's growing the fungi. And so you have high levels of fungi in these more woody type plant. And also the trees themselves, they have a long lifespan. And so they tend to develop long-term relationships. And the fungi kind of help promoting that bacteria. They're great for the annuals typically that live a lot shorter. Now there are some annuals that like a balance or maybe a little bit more fungi. But if you're going to have a woody plant, you're probably going to want more of a fungally dominated soil. And so these fungal foods, seed coats, ground meals, fish oil, fish hydrolysate, kelp, humic, fulvic acids, these are all things that will stimulate fungi growth in your soil. So when I can, if I'm lacking in fungi, which almost all the properties I ever work on are, we tend to lean towards these materials for our NPK or micronutrients. So kelp has, so this one right here, as you can see, NPK, it's almost nothing, like 1 nitrogen, 0.1 phosphorus, and 2 potassium. So there's almost no nutrients in terms of NPK, but the micronutrients are there. And so, the kelp is also potentially a fungal food. So we're getting micronutrients, we're developing fungi. So we're just really focusing on, again, fungal foods is what I primarily, if I can get my nitrogen, my phosphorus, my potassium, my micronutrients from fungal foods, that's where I tend to lean. But again, it depends on your goals for what your soil is, and having that preliminary testing and knowing where you need to go will kind of give you an idea of what kind of foods to feed the system. All right, neutralizing toxicity. So let's see. So obviously, I'm dealing a lot with municipal compost a lot of the times when I'm working with ag, because agriculture, they can't afford to buy high-end lab-tested compost. Like, it's about $1,200 on average for a cubic yard of like lab-tested high-quality compost, where you can get a cubic yard of municipal compost, not matured, but they just make it and send it out for about $23. So there's a huge price difference. And so what I end up doing is I actually use humic acids. Sometimes we'll use bottled humic acids. We'll use granular too. And then we also use leachates from high quality compost, like the humic acid coming out of that, and we'll treat this municipal compost. So we'll spray it on, we'll mix the granular humic acids into it, and just allowing these components to slowly start binding to some of that toxicity and just kind of expedite the whole process of that maturation phase, and as well as again, we're trying to deal with the toxicity, because the toxicity is slowing down the biology, and if we expedite the biology, that's where we get the profound results. So soil, you can again use the humics, the fulvics. They have all these sites on them that bind to toxicity, but we also use a lot of carbon. It's called biochar typically, but you can use charcoal. Now, I always tell people, though, be careful. You don't want to go to the store and just buy any random charcoal that's for your grill, because they might put an accelerant on it to get it to ignite quickly or something. So those chemicals might offset the toxicity, or they might add more toxicity to the system. So don't do that. So you either want to buy clean materials, or we'll teach you how to make your own clean materials, which we're going to do in a little bit today. So you can, again, use charcoal, humics, fulvics to clean up compost, soil, water, your feedstocks, and of course, do lab testing before and after. Learn, document, become a little scientist. Because all really it is, what makes you a scientist to a certain extent is just writing it down and documenting that process. So if you document it, it's a really great way to kind of then share what you've learned with others, so we can kind of keep building on each other's experience. All right, so mimicking nature's soil layers. So I'm going to go a little bit away. Some of the terms I might use might be a little bit off in terms of the traditional science terms, but I like to kind of imagine this in I don't know, it's just a more fun, animated, easy to digest kind of image for me. And so when I say these different layers, they may not be exactly as if you looked up like a soil science thing, but when I see this upper layer up here, I think topsoil, I think compost basically. And then actually above that, typically we typically would like to have, especially if you go into a forest, you have like a mulch, right? So I like to correlate these layers. You have your mulch layer, you have your compost or your topsoil, and then you have your subsoil or your base soil structure, which is your sands, your silts, your clays. And I like to think of it as like a house. So you have your roof is the mulch, and then you have your topsoil, which is kind of like your main living space. You got your kitchen, your bedroom, etc. And then you have the basement, which also you have a whole bunch of life going on down there. So there's a party in the basement, and you have a whole bunch going on in there as well. But there are these different important layers, and you don't want to take the basement and put it on top of the roof, right? Because imagine if someone came and mixed your house up and your kitchen is in your attic or something, then you can't cook dinner. So I am always very particular about the soil layering process, keeping those layers intact, and I've kind of come up with a really interesting way of kind of mimicking these layers using some materials that are free or cheap at hand. So of course, a lot of the times, always, you're going to have your parent material. So whatever your type of particles are, your soil, excuse me, so your sand, your silt, your clay, your rocks, that's your base essentially. I typically will come in with my compost and just put like an inch of compost. A lot of the compost that we get, again, the municipal stuff, it's dry and it's hydrophobic, so you put water on it and it doesn't penetrate through. So I don't want to go more than an inch because the water just sits on top. And then also, I've seen small particles, like when I was using organic fertilizers, for instance, I've seen water sit on top, and it just literally created like a mold, and like it pretty much created an anaerobic system. And so, not that all molds are bad, but it wasn't healthy for the tree that I was growing. So limiting to 1 inch to allow for some infiltration to occur and for oxygen to diffuse through that material, and then putting my 2-inch edible roof layer. So again, so you have your sand, silt, clay. Then of course this is more than 1 inch, but this is when I'm installing municipal compost, which is hydrophobic. I do a 1-inch layer of that, and then my 2-inch layer of mulch. And again, don't mix the layers. And then I, of course, add my organisms after I've done all my preliminary testing, and make sure my water and everything is. But this layering process is really cool, because now I've essentially recreated what we see in nature. I've set up my house, and so instead of waiting for nature to come in and build their own house and die in that process of that creation, and then essentially they're losing their quantities. It reminds me of like when people were coming on boats to the Americas, and they were essentially like, they'd come in and a good portion of them would die because there wasn't cabins or food systems, or there wasn't a situation that they were used to live off of. So they would sacrifice themselves to a certain extent. A small portion would survive, building infrastructure. The next round comes in, the survivability rate increases as each round comes in. If we've developed the structure right from the get-go, you have a higher survivability rate, and so you get an increased success, which is pretty cool. Yeah. I definitely prefer to compost it if possible, and then include it in that layer. If you just want to like recreate nature to a certain extent and like take a little bit here and a little bit, because an animal will poop on top of that roof, right? Sometimes they might dig and poop, but for the most part they'll drop it one right on top. So you can do that, but I'm kind of anti-sheet manuring. Like some people are like, oh, I'm going to manure this whole hillside and plant trees, and I'm like, oh, show me in nature an animal that just poops in layers over miles. Like that just doesn't happen. So you can use it on top too, but just imagine as if you were doing it like an animal, and like a little bit here, a little bit there. Otherwise, if you're going to use quite a bit, I definitely think composting it is more ideal. Janelle's more of our compost expert though, so she would be the follow-up person I would ask on that. So calculating your compost/mulch needs. So if you were to recreate that soil layer technique that we just were talking about, you're going to want to figure out how much compost and mulch you need to do that. So the first thing that you'll need to do is measure your area in square footage. It's pretty simple. There's so many tools nowadays. If your area is really small, you can use a tape measure. If your area is a little bit larger, I use these quite often. And if your area is quite large, Google Earth is really, really great at measuring properties. I use it all the time, and I'm not going to get into it in this, but during a break or afterwards, if you want to learn how to use Google Earth to measure your property, I'd be more than happy to show you. It literally takes seconds. So once you got your area in square footage, then you utilize a mulch calculator, which this one right here is the one that I typically use. It's just the most straightforward, and really all you're doing is you put in your square footage, and then underneath that it asks for your depth. So 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch. So again, we're going to do, it says it's a mulch calculator, but it's still the same calculation for if you're doing your compost application too. So 1 inch for the compost, and then you put in your square footage, you click, let it calculate for you, it gives you your numbers. And then for the mulch, you have, again, put in your square footage, and then you just put 2 inch. And again, you click calculate, and boom, you got your numbers. So it's a really quick, easy way to determine how much compost yardage you're going to need, and how much wood chip yardage you're going to need, or mulch, whatever I use wood chips, but whatever mulch you're going to be utilizing. All right, so chop and drop. So this is something I love to do. I actually get creative sometimes, and I kind of like weave these little wreaths around my trees. I love to do it. And it's just like, the way I think of it is we're just creating, because like, there's just every single different layer that you have that can occupy like a different niche, for instance. Like this material right here, I've noticed that when I pick it up, oh, excuse me. All right, I got a couple more minutes. So I'm going to try to expedite this, but so I essentially, this material, when you set it on the ground, if you ever look underneath it, you'll see various bugs living underneath it that may not live under your compost directly or under your mold. And so you're creating a diversity of habitat. So again, we want to create multiple homes so we can create diversity and community, because community is ultimately what's going to create a thriving system. So again, so what I do a lot of times, my annual crops, I chop them down, and then I kind of like make a little ring around my fruit trees, and then the excess I'll compost. But I like to create like a little layer, and it looks pretty too if you do it just right. You can even decorate it a little bit for Christmas. So yeah, if you really wanted to too, you could of course use very specific cover crops. So nitrogen fixers, root crops, etc., and then use those to chop and drop to get very specific. So nitrogen fixers, obviously, you can get some extra nitrogen in the system. Weeds before going to seed have done that quite a bit. Not Bermuda grass, but of course, a lot of the other weeds you can utilize. Non-woody perennials is something I use. If they're woody, they're going to sit there for quite a while, so that's probably not something you're going to do. And potentially avoid disease plants, although I've been known to actually take diseased plants from my neighbors and purposely infect my trees so that I can show people, look, I can cure them with biology. So I do that, but I'm a little more advanced, so I just recommend don't do that first. And then if you have the property or space and you want to experiment, then go for it. So edge systems. So nature is really cool in a sense that these edges in a system are literally the most diverse systems. So imagine in this forest, how many organisms are living in this forest, right? I'm just going to put out a number. Say you have 1,000 organisms in this forest. Say you have 1,000 organisms in this grassland. Well then, on this edge, there's very specific organisms that need that edge to survive. Say there's 500, let's say 500. Say there's 500 organisms that need this and they thrive in this system. But guess what? They don't just have 500 organisms, because the organisms from over here, they come into this and they also interact with this. And these 1,000 over here come in, so you end up with maybe 1,500 organisms or more potentially interact. So this edge right here is creating opportunities for diverse interactions and really increases your systems. So like something, so these are some ideas of edges. So curved crop rows rather than straight. They can increase the amount of edge you have. But if you ever notice, like if you have a straight line and you watch the shadow is very consistent. But if you curve that, it creates these little micro pockets where their area is shaded, this area is not shaded. All those different microclimates create different opportunities for different organisms to thrive. So diversity. Crenulated pond is just a pond that has many curves to it, essentially, rather than just perfectly round. Same thing as a curved crop row, essentially. Keyhole gardens. Should have put a picture of that up here, honestly, but basically that is just kind of like a keyhole where, it starts narrow, where your pathway is narrow, and then it kind of like a circle on top, and that circle, the sun as it's moving, you have different shade edges, and so you're creating different opportunities, and you actually can get a lot of plants. You can actually get more plants per square foot when you start using these curved type systems. Fences are really cool. I wish I had. Oh, I can draw right here. So let's see. This is something I like to do. We're actually doing this on a nature preserve. So you ever notice that when you're next to a fence, that sometimes you find trash and debris, getting stuck in that fence? That edge is accumulating things from the air. And so what I like to do is, first of all, so if you're going to have a tree that you want to plant and you want to lessen its water use, well, the wind is going to take away that water. So you can put a little pallet on some stakes acting as a windbreak, But that doesn't just act as a windbreak, because then the birds come in and they land on your pallet, and then when they fly away, they poop, and they give you free fertilizer and free seed. And it all accumulates here at the base. And so then, if you really wanted to get fancy, you can add some compost and mulch down here and increase the likelihood of, the seeds to actually germinate. And so then you end up with all kinds of shrubby plants and maybe even some viney plants. And next thing you know, this pallet becomes a living system. It doesn't have to be a pallet, but I've just used pallets, for instance, because they're free and they're abundant. But yeah, it's just really cool, and it creates an edge effect, essentially, where a whole bunch of organisms, if you had no pallet there, this blank open slate, only a specific amount of organisms can thrive there. But this has now created its own little microclimate, its own little ecosystem, and maybe even multiple within it. So now you've greatly diversified the potential and increased the health and the vigor of the plant species that you're trying to grow next to it. So you can, especially in the desert, this could be really helpful. Yeah, so you definitely want to lean towards not treated if possible. We're not composting the pallets, so and especially in the desert and it's dry and stuff, pallets are kind of sitting upright and lingering. And then eventually what I like to do is I move them after a period of time. And if they do start to break down or something, then I probably won't leave it there anymore. Just leave it there for maybe a year or two. Start that process of developing the foliage and the material, because the plants themselves become an edge in a sense, and they start capturing incoming wind, filtering out particles out of that wind, whether it's toxicity or it's fertilizer or it's biology. But yeah, I definitely think that being mindful of your pallets is, if you can get clean pallets, that's definitely, because again, we want to lessen the toxicity in our inputs. So that's a great question. But sometimes I can't, and I'd rather use a toxic pallet and get this edge system built. Otherwise, it would just be a toxic system because literally it's just bacterially dominated. Wind is just carrying tons of pesticides and herbicides, and I need to get the biology in the soil. So I'll use it temporarily to create that microclimate, let the organisms start thriving, and then take it out before it does break down and get into the soil. And again, it's standing up. It's not sitting flat on the soil. So majority of it is not actually having enough contact time with the soil to stay hydrated, because the sun and wind is drying it out. So that the moisture is a factor in it breaking down and releasing things. But again, if you can reduce pollution, do your due diligence. Yeah.
Just real quick, how far, where do you place the pallet? Is it like at the drip line or
It really depends on the tree, but I tend to I don't want to place it too close to the tree. I want to give the tree a little bit of space. But I do about 3 to 6 feet. It is generally, I want it close enough to where it really breaks the wind, but not too close to where it's right up on it and shading it out or something. And that's another thing, is that your wind might be coming from a sun dominant side. It really depends on the region. So you want to be mindful. You don't want to shade the tree out, because then it's going to slow its progress. Unless it needs shade in the beginning. It depends on your species. So obviously learn what tree you're using. And so it might be better to put it closer in the beginning to get that shade if you had, say, an avocado or something. But I guess it really depends on the plant that you're using. But generally 3 to 6 foot is kind of what I go with. And again, just look at what tree you're trying to grow. And it doesn't have to be one pallet. It can be multiple pallets. You can get, if you have wind coming from multiple directions, it's just really trying to cut down on that wind, filter out the particles, and basically kind of like how we're chopping and dropping a second ago, but we're dropping now things out of the air, and we're attracting life. Again, the biology in the wind, but also obviously the birds and other organisms and anything that might be in their poop, whether it's seed or more biology or fertilizer, etc. Any other questions on that? All right. So additional housing. So biochar, number one. So this is this is an image basically of biochar at a really close up level, and you can see all these beautiful pore structures. So I like to think of this as like a coral reef. So imagine you go into almost at the forest, you go into the ocean and you see a thriving coral reef. how much life is there, right? It's just like, I almost think of it as like, I know New York City is super toxic, but they have these huge skyscrapers, right? They have so much life per square foot, essentially, that they're really getting mass amounts of life in a small amount of space. And biochar can do the same thing. It has tremendous amounts of surface area. And I mean, I'm forgetting the number off the top of my head, but if I recall correctly, something along the lines of like a gram or something of biochar that you can easily fit into your hand. If you were to unroll it, it has so much surface area that it can equate to like a tennis court or something like that. So imagine how much bacteria you can cover on a tennis court, and now you can fit that in the palm of your hand. So we can really increase our housing with biochar in the soil. And so you can put it in the soil or on top of the soil, either one. If you put it on top of the soil, it actually captures off-gassing. So say if you were doing static composting and things were going anaerobic and you wanted those smells, those nutrients that were gassing off to not be lost from the system, you could use charcoal to capture that, retain it in the system, and but it also helps with soil off-gassing too, because the soil is breathing and it releases a certain amount of pollution into the air, and so you can capture that as well. But I really like to keep it in the root zone if possible, and you get most amount of benefits that way. I usually use about 10% of my soil medium when I do that. Rocks and boulders are really cool, and like you can see in nature, they just sit on top, they hang out. And if you ever pick up a log or a rock in your garden or in nature, you'll see life under it, life in it. And so again, we're just creating more and more housing and diversity of houses because, again, community is key. So clay pot is maybe not something that you would see necessarily growing in, I mean, it's technically made out of nature because clay comes from the soil. But in your garden, you might never, again, move a clay pot and then all of a sudden cockroaches and everyone starts scattering. And so that's another opportunity. And actually in the Amazon, they made super soil by taking all of their clay pottery. It was all the broken shards. They basically took their organic waste, they composted it with their clay pottery, and then they basically put them in these pits, and they would essentially create a biochar with some of that organic material. So it was like partially charred, partially compost, a lot of clay-like materials, and it's beautiful. Like they literally were creating sustainable food systems where you were unable to, you couldn't have large populations in the Amazon. You would think Amazon has this rich soil. It's not true. It's rich for the plants to grow there, but not for the crops we want to grow. All right, I got to keep moving because I don't want to keep down Janelle, sorry. So release the soil food web. So now we've done, we've did all the preliminary stuff. We've built all the variety of houses for these organisms. So now it's time to release the organisms. Now, we have the empty apartment complexes. We got to fill them. So compost teas, something we're going to talk about in a little bit. Compost extracts, we'll talk about more when we get to that. So I can, again, want to override Janelle. Compost applications. So when you take compost and you apply it to your soil, obviously you're inoculating, you're releasing the organisms into your system. And vermicompost, which is just worm casting applications. And I'm a huge fan of vermicompost. I always tell people, especially if you're doing this diversion of waste streams where it has potential pesticides, herbicides, who knows what on that food, your end product may not be as diverse as you're hoping in terms of the microbial community, but the vermicompost, these worms' guts are awesome. And so I really am a huge proponent of at least a small portion of your composting site, if you can, make a little bit of vermicompost and include that in your applications, and I'll show you in a little bit how to make teas and extracts with your vermicompost or your compost. So these are a variety of materials or techniques that we can utilize, and again, we'll go over that soon enough. So here's some resources. Permaculture Circle is really cool. They got a free permaculture course. I highly recommend. They should have taught it in school. Again, your landscape mulch calculator, soil food web, if you want to learn more about Dr. Elaine Ingham's soil food web stuff. And my website, actually, if you just go to the Learn More section, I like to feature a lot of great content providers. So all the people who have really inspired me, you can go and learn from them. So the Learn More section on there, I highly recommend. But yeah, that'll do it. So thank you, everybody.